Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you are doing well, and I hope you've had a great week this week at summer conference. I know we've really enjoyed it. It's been a great week. We're glad that it's Friday, but I think we've had a lot of great sessions, and I appreciate all of you guys for participating. I do want to give a huge shout out to all of our folks who submitted these CIMC tips and tricks videos. It was just an idea that we had that we thought would be neat to start each session, and kind of sent the plea out this spring to see who would be willing to record something. And those of you who submitted, we really appreciate them. I think they've all been great. It's neat to hear how other people, do their work and what makes their work easier. And so just wanted to say thank you for that and hope that you have enjoyed those. We do have one video that's not going to make it in any of the airings this week. It was an additional video that the Southwest region compiled for us. It was a little bit longer video, and that's why we couldn't fit it in. So we're going to work that into our fall conference, if not before. So be on the lookout for that because it's great too. I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off because, as you guys know, we have had issues sometimes with bandwidth whenever we have cameras going and some other things. So, but I just wanted you to see me. I really am here this morning. All right. So, my friends, time has come. Today is the day. I know you're used to this, but go ahead and click play to get the full effect. Hopefully my volume is not too terribly loud where you can still hear me talk for just a moment. But today's a big day, right? And I don't know about you, but there is just something about the Olympics that's exciting. It sort of brings out my patriotic side, and I always learn something new, either from watching the events or seeing news stories or something else is airing on TV. So I always learn something new. And we're going to call this session Reporting for the Gold, really for a couple of reasons. First, reporting student POL results is ultimately connected to our funding for gold, right? But really, when I think about the Olympic rings, the design of that logo many, many years ago was so purposeful. The 5 colors encompass all nations without exception, and the connection of the rings express unity and inclusion of all. And that's really the idea of our new POL guide. It is designed to be inclusive of all things POL for you guys as the CIMC. So let's jump in to administration and reporting for the gold. So we're going to go straight to the blocks. I want to recognize these folks who have put in so much time and energy. They have given such great feedback in the development of this guide. They've provided resources. They have, edited. They have worked tirelessly to make this guide what it is today. And so I want to express my appreciation to them for all of their work in this development. And I know that many of you on the call have probably also provided additional feedback as these folks have reached out to you for your input as well. So thank you all for your participation. And I think it's important that we have a guide that was created by you for you. It's not just one person's thoughts or opinions. So I hope that you'll find this a very useful tool. So if we take a look at the guide, you'll hear me call it the guide. You'll hear me call it the POL guide. The official name of the guide is the North Carolina Career and Technical Education Proof of Learning Administration and Reporting Guide for Curriculum and Instructional Management Coordinators. That is a mouthful. That's why you're going to hear me call it the guide or the POL guide. But we wanted to be sure that you knew that this was a guide for you and the purpose of that guide. If you've not already accessed a draft copy of this guide, you may do so on the CIMC State Assessment Moodle. It's also posted in the CTE Directors Moodle under the Summer Conference folder. And you've heard me say draft, and you see it here on screen. We are releasing this guide in draft status for a couple of reasons. Number one, we're still expecting possibly some changes to the programming in the way we report some things in NCCT admin. So I wanted to be sure that we have a chance in September when the new system rolls out that we're able to see what that looks like. We've seen some previews. We have an idea of what some things look like. But I just want to make sure that we have a chance to really look at that and be sure that our guide aligns with what we see in NCCT admin. So it's not confusing when we go to implement that work. So that's the first reason. And really the other reason is I I kind of like the idea of having a window of time where everyone can take a look at it and let us know if we've missed something, or if you think there's something that we haven't addressed, or if something has changed between the last time we reviewed this and now. I just think it'd be a great way for you guys to all get your eyes on it and give us feedback if needed prior to these guides being printed. And we will print some copies for you and have them available at our fall conference. And I think it'll be an exciting time for us to kind of go through this new process together. So today we're going to go through about half of the guide, which is essential for USCIMCs as you begin your work this fall with your new teachers, or your teachers coming on this for new school year. We're not going to do state assessment training today, and we're not going to go through that part of the guide. We will be doing that in regional groups this fall when it's a little bit closer to the time that you would need to use that information. Didn't want to do too much at one time. So if we just do a quick overview of the guide, you're going to see a general information section. We're going to define the different POL types. And then the guide is broken down into 4 sections, one for each of the POL types. And within each of those sections, you'll see information about administration procedures, reporting student results. You'll see information about state monitoring. And then the bulk of the guide really is the appendices. And that's where you're going to find lots of support and additional detailed information for implementing your work. So we'll go ahead and go through the general information section. In the first 2 pages, you're going to see just a definition of the different POL types. And that is, just to help you kind of wrap your head around what those POL types are and why they're used or how they're used. On page 2, we have a section devoted to NCVPS. And I wanted to make sure I covered this today because NCVPS has given some of us headaches in the past, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So NCVPS is responsible for administering a PBM and a local POL when those are the assigned POL types. And so NCVPS, in their course development and in their implementation of their courses that they've developed, they are aware and they have the resources that they need to administer the PBM and also the local POL. Individual school districts would be responsible for administering the credential and the state assessment POLs. NCVPS doesn't have the ability to be able to offer those credentials. And then we know that we're going to handle state assessments in our own districts anyway. So any local requirements that you place on your students, aside from the required POL, are going to be the responsibility of the local district. So I know this past spring we did a huge survey for those of you who had students enrolled in NCVPS courses. And if you had additional requirements that you place on your students, such as if the student didn't earn a credential when it was identified as the POL, then you required them to have a teacher-made assessment. Or if a student did not demonstrate proficiency on the PBM, then you were requiring them to take an additional teacher-made assessment. And we sent that information over to NCVPS so those teachers could be prepared to administer those teacher-made assessments at the end of the semester without being bombarded by hundreds and hundreds of emails asking for those teacher-made exams to be given. So we're not doing that this year. If your local district is going to place that requirement on a student beyond what the state requirements are for a POL, then we're going to ask you to take care of that requirement. So if you're going to ask your students to take a teacher-made test when they don't earn the credential, then you're going to be responsible for developing and administering that teacher-made test. Likewise, if we look at online vendor courses, many of you have begun using vendors such as Edgenuity, Edmentum, and so on to either provide curriculum and or instruction. We're going to follow those same guidelines. So the vendor would be responsible for administering the PBM and the local POL when those are the assigned POL types. And you locally would be responsible for administering the credential and the state assessment POLs. If you're using a vendor and the POL type is identified as a PBM, it's probably going to be necessary for you to share that PBM with the vendor. Angela LeMay and I talked about this, and we realized that, the vendor's not necessarily going to know what our required POL is. And so it may require some communication between you and the vendor to make sure that they understand what the requirements are for the student to be able to demonstrate proficiency for that course. So when we look at NCVPS and we look at the third-party vendor courses, we're going to follow the same guidelines. Local districts will administer the credential and state assessment POLs, and the third-party or NCVPS will administer PBM and local POLs. And Anna, if you can help me monitor the chat.
Be happy to.
Thank you. So let's start looking at some of the ins and the outs within the general information section. And if you were in the director session earlier this week, you've seen these same questions, so you don't have to spoil it for everybody else. So let's just use the chat box to respond here. My first question is, when are POLs administered? Your choices are A, the first 5 or 10 days of the semester, B, the last 5 or 10 days of a semester, C, the last 30 days of the semester or year, D, within the enrollment term, and E, depends on the POL type. Well, it looks like you guys are awake this morning. I see lots of E's, and that is the correct answer. So within the guide on page 3, you're going to see a chart that outlines when each POL type is to be administered. So as you guys know, state board policy restricts the administration of a state assessment to the last 5 days of a semester for semester-long courses and the last 10 days of the year for year-long courses. And that would also include indicator POLs for students on the OCS or ECS. The other POL types, and we included third party just in case any of your local course options use a third party assessment. But your other POL types, really, the administration window is within that enrollment term or enrollment period. So we know that PBMs often are just embedded within the curriculum. And so it's hard to determine when that PBM should be administered. Often it's throughout the entire semester. So we don't really have a defined period for that. If we look at a credential POL, sometimes that happens at the end of the semester. Sometimes that happens maybe after the first 9 weeks. Whenever the students have completed their training and preparation for that credential and they're ready to sit for that credential, we want them to have the opportunity to do that. You also have courses like NCCER credential courses that students are earning modules or components of that overall credential or tethered credential throughout the semester. So again, no defined period there. When we look at the local POL, it's going to fall a little bit more in line with the CTE state assessments, but because it's a local POL, we have a little bit more flexibility. State board policy does not really confine us to that last 5 or 10 days. We certainly wouldn't want you to administer that, 2 weeks early. We want you to preserve instructional time as much as possible, but do know that you do have a little bit of flexibility when it comes to that local POL. And then I just noted here under the chart that students may be given the opportunity to earn the credential POL after the conclusion of the course. So that's the one POL that we can report results for beyond the enrollment term. And so when you think of students who either need a little bit more time to prepare for their credential, or maybe it's a student on the OCS or ECS who is going to go through the course again to cover the rest of the blueprints, we can certainly report those credentials earned beyond the enrollment period if needed. And there's instructions in the manual about that.
Missy,
so let's look. Yes.
This is Anna. If I may interrupt you for a couple questions, do you want to do questions as we go?
That'd be fine.
Or wait till the end? That's entirely up to you.
We can do them now. That's fine.
These folks would like to have the tips and tricks videos posted. Will you be posting those?
I sure can. I can do that. I can post them to Moodle. Sure. It's a great question.
And then we have another. I thought we were told that the NCVPS would be administering the SAPOLs.
So no, NCVPS does not administer state assessments because those students are engaged in those courses virtually. And there's no way for the NCVPS staff to be able to provide that secure testing environment. So that is the responsibility of the local district. It always has been for the state assessment to be administered within the district. That answer the question? Cool.
Yes, he said
That it?
thank you.
Is that it for now?
So far, so good. Yes, ma'am.
Great. So let's look at some of the reporting or how we use student results. Which of these POLs count a minimum of 20% of a student's overall grade? So it does my heart good to see you guys all put D, state assessment. And the reason I say that is because so many questions came in this year about, well, what do I use for the student's final exam grade if the credential POL, if they didn't earn it, or if we didn't offer it because of COVID, or, you know, am I supposed to use the student's PBM grade as their final exam grade? Well, that's a local decision. The only POL that is required to count a minimum of 20% of a student's overall grade is the CTE state assessment, and that's outlined in state board policy. We'll come back to that in just a second. Here's the next question. We talk about reporting. So which of the POLs listed here are reported in Perkins 5 indicator 5S1? Okay, good. And it looks like Glenn's having trouble with sound. If somebody can help him, maybe on the backside, I'd appreciate that. So yes, B, credential. Credential is the only student result that is reported in 5S1, but I want to make sure that I note here, it's just a little bit tricky. That's only reported for CTE concentrators. Okay, so our credential POL is reported in 5S1 for CTE concentrators. So now let's flip over to 5S4. Which of the POLs listed are reported in 5S4? Okay, Tandra gets the gold medal, and Madeline, there we go. We've got some gold medalists coming in. So this was a little bit of a tricky question because I didn't give you multiple response choices. But we know that PBM, local, and state assessment POLs are all reported in 5S4, and that's for all CTE participants, not just concentrators. That's all participants in that year. Okay, so credentials are counted in 5S1. The other three are counted in 5S4. Good job, guys. So in the guide on page 3, you'll see this nifty little chart that we included to help you track each of the POL types, whether or not it counts as 20% of the student's overall grade, and how it is included in state and federal reporting. So for example, if we're looking at a PBM course, I'm sorry, a POL type of PBM, those POLs could be created by DPI or locally. It's a local course option. And then it's not going to count as a minimum of 20% of the student's overall grade, and it will count in 5S4. As a contrast, if we go down to, let's say, maybe a credential, okay, and we look at, of course, those are going to be third-party vendor creations. And if we look at that course, no matter if it's in standard, pilot, or LCO status, we're going to count that in 5S1 for our CTE concentrators. So it doesn't matter if a course is in pilot status. If a student earns that credential, it will still count toward that 5S1 indicator. Whereas if you're looking at some of the others in 5S4, if they're in pilot status, they don't count. I think this will be an easy way for you guys to track each of your POL types and course status and cross-reference that to how they count in your reporting. Any questions about that so far? Great. So on page 4, we've given a little bit of attention to the notification of POL requirements. And I think oftentimes we get so bogged down in the organization and making sure that the administrative side of our POL process is covered that we forget some of the communication that should happen. So we've just reminded you here that each year you should inform students and their parents or guardians about the state requirements for POLs and then any district requirements that you've placed on those students for those CTE courses. You should also inform them of when those POL administrations will take place and how the results will be used. And then after the administration of those POLs, you should provide a score report and or some type of interpretation within 30 days. So making sure that students and parents know how they did on those POLs and helping them to understand those results within 30 days of having that score report or POL completed with a score. We also cover the different staff roles, and these are the ones that we highlight. We've got the CIMC PPOC, who is basically responsible for the entire outfit at the district level. And then we have a CIMC that could either be at the district level or the school level. And then we trickle down to the building level coordinator and then the classroom administrator, which is typically the CTE teacher of record, but maybe other certified staff in your building that are administering assessments when needed. So those roles are outlined on pages 4 and 5 of the guide. I also want to make sure that you read through this section on handling student information. Again, I think sometimes we get so bogged down in the routine tasks that we do as CIMCs that we forget to really train our teachers on how they should be handling student information. All of our student information is protected under FERPA, and that would include their name, their student ID, and their results. So obviously we wouldn't want teachers posting, back in the day, teachers may have posted a class roster and had their final results so that students can see what they made on that exam. We don't want to do that, and I think you guys know that. But we also have to be very careful that those class roster forms that are included with the POL accountability forms, like if you think about the state assessment or the credential accountability form, it has that class roster to it where students are being marked met, not met. Those shouldn't be laying around on teachers' desks. They shouldn't be laying around on your desks as other teachers are coming in and out. We just need to make sure that we are handling that student information carefully and that those forms are being stored appropriately so that that student information is protected. So that is outlined on pages 5 and 6 in the guide. So let's talk about student eligibility. Which students are required to complete the identified POL? So regardless of which POL type, which students are required to complete that POL? Okay, good. Lots of H's. And that's true with maybe an exception. So again, another tricky question. I'm not trying to be too tricky. But if we look at this chart, and this chart is actually not included in the guide. It's something that I put together as I was doing the presentation. Maybe something we need to add to the guide, but all of the information is outlined within these sections of the guide. So if we look at each situation and each POL type, you'll see that pretty much the student is always going to be required to complete the POL when they're enrolled in the course. The only exception that we have to that is going to be when a student is in credit recovery. So when a student is in credit recovery, there is no power school enrollment. So you may locally enroll that student in a placeholder course or, some other generic course code so that they have something on their schedule. They have a teacher to report to. But there is no CTE Power School enrollment for that student in credit recovery. So we don't collect data. When there's no Power School enrollment, we don't collect data on that student. So regardless of the POL type, it is going to be a local decision as to whether or not you require a student to go through that or take that POL when they're in credit recovery. You may decide locally that if the student demonstrate proficiency, you may decide that they're going to be required to do the PBM again. Obviously, if they've already earned the credential, you're not going to make them take that again. You may have another requirement. That's, again, a local decision. But I do have an asterisk by the state assessment one, and that's because that's probably one of the bigger questions that we get. We would expect you to administer the CTE state assessment for a student in credit recovery if they never took the state assessment. So if they don't have an assessment score for their previous enrollment, they just never took it, then we would expect you to go ahead and administer that state assessment. But if the student already took the assessment, regardless of what they scored, pass, fail, it doesn't matter. That is a local decision as to whether or not you want them to retake that. We would not require them to retake that exam. That would be your call. So I see a question in the chat. What is CDM? So credit by demonstrated mastery is the process by which students can attempt to earn credit, full credit for a course without sitting through the course. And so there are some specific guidelines outlined based on the POL type that a student would have to complete in order to earn the credit for that course. So it's sort of like the equivalent of a CLEP. If you think about, CLEPing out of courses in college, it's sort of like that. So each POL type course, there are 2 phases in the CDM process. And so the CDM guide will outline what is the phase 1 requirement, what is the phase 2 requirement. And like, for example, for credential, if the course is a credential POL, phase 1 would be a local assessment, phase 2 would be the credential. So I'll make sure that you guys have access to that guide so that you can review those. And then I just noted here, and this is also included in the guide, there's actually a chart that outlines EL student participation. EL students are always required to participate in the state assessments, but their data is not reported until year 3. So let me check the chat real quick. Michelle, great question. NCVPS teachers do not have access. Well, I take that back. They do have access, but they are not required to enter POL information in the NCCT admin site. The process that we have set up with NCVPS is they provide grade reports to your school or district contacts, whoever your NCVPS contact is. They have a very structured system for reporting grades and attendance if they take it. Excuse me. So on that final grade report that comes from NCVPS, they will include the POL result as either met or not met. And then you would retrieve that from that final grade report that's shared with your NCVPS contact so that the BLC or the classroom teacher, or well, no, I guess NCVPS is the classroom teacher. If there's another person at this who's helping data entry there, they could enter those results. So the school district will be required to enter those POL results for NCVPS courses. I'll make sure I answered all the parts of that question. Yes, I think I got all of that. So it's definitely going to be the school, whoever is the designated person for that, whether it is a classroom teacher, another classroom teacher, a BLC, or the CIMC, him or herself.
And Missy, we have another one, credit recovery. Can you restate? So if they fail the POL, then they do not have to take again. Local decision, correct?
So in credit recovery, it is a local decision whether or not the student is to retake the POL, regardless of the POL type. And again, the reason for that is because we do not collect data on credit recovery because there is no Power School enrollment. So that credit recovery process is one that is really determined locally how the student is going to earn back the portions of that course that they did not meet when they first took the course. So if they repeat the course for credit, yes, they are required to complete the POL. The only exception for that would be if they've already earned the credential, obviously you're not going to report that again. And if they earned a 70 or higher, if they demonstrated proficiency on the state assessment the first time they took the course, they can opt to use their previous score. So when a student is repeating a course for credit, they are required to redo the POL unless they've already earned the credential, or if they've already demonstrated proficiency 70 or higher on the state assessment. They can choose to retake the state assessment for a higher score, or they can choose to use their previous score. If they choose to retake, they can choose the higher of the two scores for their final grade.
We have another question. Do OCS students have an indicator assessment in addition to credential if the credential is POL?
No, they do not. So I would direct you back to those indicator POL guidelines for information about that. And if you want to go back and watch the pre-recorded session that Shannon and I did with Beverly, we've outlined that. It's also clearly outlined in the guide as to when a student is required to complete an indicator POL. But just to clarify quickly, when we look at the credential POL, we are collecting on the credential. So if a student is taking the course for the first time, let's just say Microsoft Word and PowerPoint, the first one that came to mind. If a student on the OCS is taking Microsoft Word and PowerPoint and they only completed half or a third of the blueprint in the first time that they took the course, then they're not going to sit for the credential until they completed that blueprint. So let's say maybe after the second time they've taken the course, they've completed the blueprint, the teacher feels like they're ready to sit for the exam, they would sit for the exam. That's when the credential results are reported. We don't collect any type of IPOL result for a credential POL. As a matter of fact, you shouldn't see a place in NCCT admin to record that any longer. We have removed that option because there is no such data collection. If you decide locally to implement that requirement, I would just urge you to be sure that what is required of a student on the OCS or ECS is the same as what you're requiring of your students who are on the Future Ready Core. So you wouldn't expect your student on the OCS to take a teacher-made test when you don't expect your students who are not on the OCS to take a test. It would need to be the same requirement.
Okay, and Misty, Michelle's asking a follow-up question. May I ask when this procedure started? And that was going back up to the NCVPS question, I think.
Okay. So let's see, who has the responsibility for communicating the results to the CIMC so that the information can be entered in the admin site? So no, we do not want, what we don't want is we don't want districts reaching out to NCVPS for all of this information because we have a process in place for them to send the information to us. So whoever is your contact for NCVPS, whether it's your distance learning coordinator, you know, you may have a lab facilitator who's with those students when they come to the lab and work on those NCVPS courses. Whoever it is at the school level who is the contact person for NCVPS, they will be the ones getting the score report. So you may ask them to share with you the score report. You may have to reach out to them for those results at the end. However you decide to do that locally, it will be the district's responsibility to find that POL result on that final score report. I hope that helps.
And then go back to one before. Dana Russell asks, so if they repeat the course, then they take the state assessment?
Again, if they repeat the course for credit, they have an option to use their previous score if the previous score is 70 or higher. That is outlined in state board policy and it's referenced in the manual. So again, you know, a student should have the choice. If they've already taken the state assessment the first time they took the course and they earned a 70 or higher on that state assessment, they can choose to use that score and not retake the test. If they did not earn 70 or higher, so 69 and below, they would be required to retake the state assessment.
And then in those same lines, credit recovery students are entered into PowerSchool with course code XR at the end of the code. They show up in NCCT admin. We just mark as repeating the course in CTE admin, right?
No, that is not right. So we no longer should have a course enrollment for credit recovery students. That process changed a few years ago. What happens is once the student has earned the credit for that course, if they've recovered the credit, then the data manager goes in and adds that into the historical grades with the XR. So there should not be an initial, when you enroll them in PowerSchool with a course code, let's say FN412 XR, that creates another enrollment for that student. It's almost like they're repeating the course for credit. So if you're using credit recovery, you should not have a PowerSchool enrollment with a CTE course code. I hope that makes sense.
I think
Okay.
we're caught up.
Okay, sounds good.
And Deborah made a comment that information needs to be sent to data managers somehow.
Okay. All right, I'll make a note. We'll figure that out.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, let's do another quick question. A medical exception request may be submitted for which POL type? This is sort of another tricky question. I mean, ultimately, you can submit a medical exception request for any POL type. We wouldn't expect to see a medical exception request submitted for a PBM credential or local POL type, mainly because there's so much flexibility in the administration window. When you look at the definition of the medical exception request, the reason why you would submit that request would be the student is not able to participate in that POL administration's designated window. So when we look at the state assessment, that's the one that's so restricted to that last 5 days of the semester or last 10 days of the year for a year-long course, including those makeup days that you get. The student can't complete that POL during that time. That's typically when we're going to see the medical exception request. There may be some rare circumstances where a student is unable to participate, maybe in the PBM throughout the semester, or maybe there's a huge component of the PBM that comes at the end of the year or the end of the semester, and the student's unable to complete that prior to the end of the collection window. So of course, in those cases, we would review a medical exception request. So again, I think those are probably going to be fewer and farther between. But if you do have a situation for a medical exception involving a POL type other than a state assessment, we would ask that you consult your RC to make sure that that medical exception request is warranted, and just get some guidance on that before you submit those requests. And there's lots of detailed information in the appendices of the guide regarding medical exception requests. So if you look at reporting student data, it obviously does occur in NCCT admin, and there are defined data collection windows. If you are curious about when those windows are, if you go to from the main menu course and then choose view semesters, you'll see this screen, and it will outline for you all of the administration or data collection windows for that academic year. Now, this obviously is still this past school year because we're still collecting data for this past school year. But you'll see all of the CDM windows, spring, fall, and summer included there. So you'll see when the window opens, you'll see when the window closes. So those of you that do early testing, you'll be able to see when that window is going to open, and know that if you are planning to test prior to that window, we'll have to come up with another process for you. Definitely have to do pencil paper, but we'll have to figure that out because the window will only open on that date. It is extremely important to know that if you're doing CDM, those windows are finite. They cannot be opened back up. So if you miss any reporting of any of the data points during that window, you're not going to be able to go back in and do that. So make sure that you're looking at those collection windows and following those dates. Okay, which POL types undergo state monitoring or audits? So I said this Monday with directors, you must have already been reading ahead in the guide, because prior to this coming school year, the only audits that we've conducted have been credential audits, aside from the IPOL audits that Shannon Baker's team completes. But beginning this year, when we call for a state monitoring or audit of this POL data, we're going to look at all the POL types, not just the credentials earned. And so that information is also provided in the guide, and we'll look at the appendices in just a minute. So just as a reminder, when we do the audits, we're going to select at least 3 districts each semester, one from a smaller LEA, one from a mid-size, and one from a large size. That selection process is random. It is independent of any other audit that you may undergo. So that selection is random. And we will notify the director and the CIMC PPOC within 2 weeks of the close of that data collection window, and provide you all the information that you need to submit that information for review. And again, we'll look at the rubrics in just a sec. Okie doke. So that's the general information for the guide. But how many of you guys knew that there were some new sports at the Olympics this year? If you know one of the new sports, I'll tell you there's 4 brand new ones. Put that in the chat. Yes, karate is one, surfing. So softball is it is new since 2008. So it's not brand new. Skateboarding, yes. So we've got karate, surfing, skateboarding. There's, yes, climbing. That's it. Y'all got them. Y'all are keeping up with your Olympics. That's awesome. Excuse me. So let's take a look at skateboarding. So if you don't know a whole lot about skateboarding, and I didn't, I had to look some stuff up. At the Olympics this year, there's going to be 2 options for skateboarding. So you've got the park and you've got street versions, I guess you would call it, of skateboarding. So if you think about like a skateboard park where they have, curved surfaces and, half pipes and all of these, cool structures that they have to do their tricks on, that's going to be one section. And then the other section is street skateboarding. So they're going to be doing their tricks on handrails and up steps and things like that. And when you look at either of those types of skateboarding, those athletes are judged or scored based on the difficulty of their tricks, their originality, maybe how fast they do it, how high they get, or how well they execute that particular trick. So that particular event makes me think of a particular POL type. Any idea what that is? Take a guess in the chat. So multiple ways to do things, scored based on how well you execute, how you can demonstrate your skill. Excellent. So the PBM, very good. So let's take a look at the PBM section of the guide. And I know we've got to speed up because we're starting to run out of time. So if I get to going too fast, y'all can stop me, but we'll try to cover it quickly. So the purpose of the PBM is to evaluate students' achievement and mastery of their course concepts. And it's really a way for students to demonstrate how they're able to apply their skills. That's the key word there, is they're able to apply their skills and the knowledge that they learn from the core standards. So within that PBM section, we again talk about eligible students and the administration window. We've already talked about that this morning, so there's no need to go over it again, but we reiterate that in that section of the guide. And this starts on page 9 of the guide. When we look at the administration guidelines for PBMs, the classroom administrator, or this, in this case, would definitely be the CTE teacher of record, they are responsible for administering that PBM as it is written in the PBM guide. And the PBM guide is included within the curriculum guide. And those are course specific. So no 2 PBMs look alike. So it is critical that you're working with your teachers to ensure that they are using the most updated course blueprint or course standards report, and that they are using the most updated curriculum guide provided by their consultant. Within that curriculum guide, they will have the specific information they need to administer the PBM. Students who require accommodations should be granted their accommodations on any parts of the PBM. And so you would refer to their IEP Section 504 EL or transitory impairment plan for to know what accommodations they need. You may need to work with your teachers to help them figure out the best way to offer those accommodations with a PBM if there are any type of questions. And then we would still require the use of a review of accommodations because this is an official POL type. The scoring of the PBM will occur by the classroom administrator or the CTE teacher. So they will be responsible for scoring that PBM using the rubrics that are provided in the PBM guide. And each of the PBMs have a scoring guide, if you will. So if there are multiple, if there's just one rubric, then obviously the overall PBM score would be the overall score of that rubric. But most of them have multiple rubrics because there's multiple components of the PBM. And so within those PBM guides, there's information on how to pull those scores from the different rubrics together. In some cases, it may just be a simple sum of all of the rubric scores. In other cases, they're weighted based on the course blueprint. So one component may count 10%, another component may count 20%, and so on. And so when that's the case, there is a very clear scoring guide. And in most cases, the consultants have provided a really nice spreadsheet where teachers can just enter in the rubric scores and automatically calculates that overall PBM score for them. As CIMCs, you will be responsible for collecting artifacts. So there'll be a POL accountability form that we'll look at in just a second, and then you'll have the PBM accountability form. And that's going to be the same form that's provided in the PBM guides for each of those courses. We're going to be reporting PBM results this year in NCCT admin. So you should see the addition of a PBM tab whenever the course has a PBM as the POL. Courses that have a PBM will also have the IPOL or local. I'm not sure exactly what it's going to look like. That's one of the things we're kind of waiting for before we finalize the guide to see what that tab looks like. But for students on the OCS or ECS, we are going to ask you to record their PBM results under the IPOL results. And the reason for that is because we don't want to record met, not met for a PBM, because that would indicate they've completed the entire PBM. So because they're using a modified version of the PBM to align with their specific modified blueprint, you're going to record their POL results in that IPOL section. And this is all outlined in the IPOL guidelines. User permissions for CIMC, BLC, and teacher. All three of those roles will be able to enter PBM results. You, of course, will determine locally how you want that to happen. So if you want your BLC to enter those results, that's up to you. But just want you to know that all three of those user roles in NCCT admin do have permission to enter met, not met. How and when are review of accommodation forms used for PBMs? That's a great question, Kelly. So you would want to make sure that you are following the IEP. And if the course has a PBM as the POL, then you probably want to have those conversations with your EC staff and go ahead and get that review of accommodations in place early before you start administering the PBM components to ensure that the classroom teacher is providing appropriate accommodations for those POLs. So I don't necessarily have an exact timeline, but I would recommend you do them early before you administer the first component of your PBM. And then at the end of the PBM section, you're going to see a checklist for CIMCs to verify that that process has been completed. So reminding you to develop your local procedures, reference the SOCA, train your staff, make sure that you have the review of accommodations form, the PBM accountability form. You're going to verify that the data entry has been is accurate in NCCT admin, and then you'll want to make sure that you resolve any data issues that you have in admin. And then, of course, you're going to store your documentation securely for 5 years. So that's the PBM section. Any questions on that we haven't covered so far? Thank you, Angela. So she said in some cases there may not be a course curriculum guide, so the PBM guide will be a standalone document. Excuse me. And yes, thank you for that reminder. I failed to mention that, Angela, that all of the PBM guides have been extracted from the curriculum guides and will be put in Vault so that you don't have to go through each of those curriculum guides and pull those PBMs out. You can retrieve them all from Vault just like you did last year. And that's always helpful for us as we are working with our teachers to be able to access those quickly. Are PBM artifacts stored at the district or the school? That's a local decision. I would recommend at a minimum that the PBM accountability form be stored at the district level, but you can develop your own local processes for how you're going to store your data or artifacts. Okay, I'm kicking it in high gear here. So when we talk about sport climbing, this is fascinating to me. So I don't know how many of you guys have ever been rock climbing before, but it's not easy, especially when you're not a small person. But there are 3 different areas for sport climbing. There's speed climbing, which the athletes have to race up a 15-meter high wall, and whoever gets the fastest time is the winner. And then you've got bouldering, which sounds to me more like the rock climbing type event. And then you've got lead climbing, where athletes have to climb as high as 15 meters high on a wall with a 6-minute time limit. And whoever reaches the highest point on the wall whenever the time ends is the winner. And so when you look at sport climbing, you're trying to get to that highest point, and athletes are scored based on how high they go, how fast they get there, and their ability to solve problems. So which POL type do you think this relates to? Yes, credentials. I agree. I think that it aligns very well with credentials. So let's take a look. There's not a lot of new information in the credential part of the guide. So if you remember last year, we had a separate credential guide. All of that information has been included here. So you're not going to have that separate credential guide any longer. And again, if we look at the purpose of those credentials, really we're trying to prepare students to get career ready, and we want them to have access and opportunities to earn those industry certifications. So within the guide, we talk about the purpose and we talk about credentials offered and reference the credentials by course report, which is, again, essential for you to access an NCCT admin to know what's available and how you might go about getting more information about those credentials. It also outlines for us credential tiers. And those are the same as they have been in terms of the structure. There may be some changes in which credential is in which tier, but you would reference that credentials by course document for that information. I believe there's also a credential tiers report. When the credential is identified as the POL type, you would note that from the SOCA document, and the administration reporting procedures are going to be the same for all credentials, regardless if it's a credential that a student can earn because it's part of the course curriculum, or it is the credential identified as the POL. Again, all students who are enrolled in the course are going to be eligible to take that credential POL, and we would expect them to have the opportunity to do that at some point. We've already talked about the administration window, so I'm going to skip over that. When we look at the administration guidelines for credentials, whether it's the POL or just any other credential, the administration of that credential assessment must follow the requirements that are outlined by the credentialing entity. And so, of course, each vendor is going to have their own requirements. Some may have specific guidelines as to who can administer the test, who can be in the room when that test is administered, and some may not have any restrictions at all. So it's going to be the responsibility of the classroom administrator to know and understand those guidelines and those requirements prior to offering that credential or administering that credential to their students. And we would ask that our teachers follow the testing code of ethics to ensure that there's a fair administration and that students don't have an unfair advantage when it comes to those credential assessments. Students who require accommodations may or may not be able to use those accommodations on those credential exams. Again, it's going to be the classroom administrator's responsibility to know if an accommodation is offered and how it is provided by that vendor. So, you can't just automatically give a student a read aloud accommodation if it's not allowed by that vendor. So, classroom administrators should work with those vendors and figure out whether or not those accommodations are available so that they'll know how to inform their students and parents what is available and how they might go about getting those accommodations if they are available. Any ancillary materials that can be used on a credential assessment is determined again by the vendor. And so we must be aware of what is allowed and what is not allowed so that there is not an unfair advantage. For example, if you're taking a particular credential assessment and you are not allowed to use any type of formula sheets or notes, then you would want to make sure that those students don't have access to those materials. So again, we're going to follow the vendor's requirements for that. Collection of artifacts is going to be the same as it has been. You're going to look at that credentials by course document to know which credential artifact is required. And then that artifact is going to, it must include the student's name or ID. That has to be clear on the artifact for us to know that that's who earned the credential. We need to know what the credential name is. So it can't just be a plain Jane certificate without any kind of information on it. We have to know what the credential name was. We have to be able to see the date that the credential was earned and or an expiration date. And then we need to know the authorizing credential entity name or logo. And so that should be included on a certificate. There are a couple of exceptions that we would consider if there's a report that a CIMC can pull from a reporting portal that may not have a particular logo or name on it, but we know that the CIMC can pull that report. We would be okay with that not having like I think about possibly NCCER or trying to think of some of the, maybe a 264 plus report. If the CIMC has access to that and can pull it, then we would be okay with not necessarily worrying about that credential name or logo. However, when the classroom administrator pulls that report, if it can be edited in any way, then we're not going to be able to accept that. So we want to make sure that, again, the artifacts are indicative of what was truly earned by the student. And then we'll have the credential accountability form. And I know we're at time, so I'm just going to quickly run through the last few things, and we won't be able to get to all of the appendices or probably any of them, but just hang with me for another couple minutes if you don't mind. So again, we're going to report student credential results in NCCT admin just as we have in the past. You've got the chart there on page 14 that talks about met, not attempted. I am not going to address not offered at this point because that's one of the things that we're waiting to see if the changes have been made that we've requested. So I'm just going to kind of hold off. We're just going to leave not offered hanging for now, and we will come back to that whenever we see how that reporting has changed in admin. And just hang on to that one for me. When you look at transfer students, I just wanted to remind you that the credential follows the student. So if you have a student in District A transfers to District B, and the credential was already recorded in District A has to reset that credential result in admin in order for District B to be able to add it in. And we've got information in the guide to help you with that. And then the same as we've had with credential state monitoring, we will include both credentials and credential POLs there, and the rubrics are included in the guide. Again, you'll have a checklist for verification at the end of that section, walking you through all of the things that you'll need to make sure you do to ensure that this process is completed correctly. So I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about karate. I found some really cool stuff. We can talk about it later. They're actually having this kata karate. I don't know anything about karate, but it's a virtual type competition, which I found interesting. So look it up if you're interested in learning more. So we'll talk more about karate, which is going to be our local POLs, and then we'll talk more about surfing, which is our state assessment POLs. We'll talk about those more in regional groups this fall and do some training with those. So you can consider yourself to be officially trained in the administration and reporting of both PBMs and credential POLs and credentials in general. So take that guide and use that information to train your teachers. Reach out with questions if you have them. So just super, super quick, I was hoping to be able to go through each of the appendices of the guide with you. This is kind of our torch. It's going to light the way for us. It's going to provide guidance and support. It's going to outline procedures. Actually, the majority of the guide is appendices. And so just real quickly, if we were to look at a couple of these, I just want to point this out so that you can know what to be looking for. For example, here, the first one is medical exception request process. It gives you the information about when you can submit that, how you do it. If we click through, I mean, there's a lot of detailed information about that. And again, we'll provide some additional training in regional groups. You'll see the rubrics that are going to be used for state monitoring audits. So depending on the POL type, so here, this is a PBM, you'll see the things that we're going to look for. when we look at those or review those materials, those artifacts, so you can scroll through those. And as you continue to scroll through all of the pages of the appendices, you'll just see lots and lots of information. A lot of it really is tailored to the state assessment because that requires so much. But I'm going to scroll through back to the end because I want you to see, and I want to make note of one thing before we end here. The accountability forms. So we've updated the accountability forms, and I want to get to that. Thanks for hanging with me a couple minutes late. There. All right, here we go. So we have incorporated a proof of learning accountability form. If you think back to what we used to have in our old guide, we had a test security form, we had another form that had to be used for training, and then we had the state assessment accountability form. So there were really 3 different forms that were required. So we've included all of the POL types into this one accountability form, and this will be for your CTE teachers. And so whenever you conduct training with them, you'll have them sign off on that they understand the requirements and the reporting and all of your local procedures for these different POL types. You'll also notice that we took the CIMC signature off here. In some cases, the school level CIMC is going to be your BLC, and they may sign that there. But we really couldn't figure out the need to have both the BLC signature and the district CIMC signature because most of those forms are being handled locally. If you'd like to add your own CIMC signature line there, you're welcome to, but we want you to know that that's not going to be a requirement. When you look at the different accountability forms, this one is exactly like what you'll see in the the PBM guides for each of those courses that have a PBM. The credential accountability form has changed very little. Again, maybe just taking a signature off, just revising, cleaning it up just a little bit. But when you get to the state assessment form has changed some, so you'll want to make sure that you take a look at that before you start state assessments. But I do want to bring your attention to Appendix GG. We have provided for you instructions for creating accountability forms in PowerSchool. And Deborah Grantham did a great job yesterday covering this in the technology roundtable. So if you weren't there, you can go back and view that recorded session. We've provided some instructions for you to be able to do that if you would like to. You're welcome to use the template that's in the guide. We'll make sure that you have access to those as Word documents if you want to do them locally or use your enrollment file and create them in a different way. That's perfectly fine. But we wanted to provide this resource for you just in case you needed it. And so we will continue to talk more about the appendices and the other components of this guide that we didn't get to today. Are there any questions that I haven't gotten to? Where in NCCT admin can you find the data collection windows? If you go over on the main menu on the right-hand side, click on course, and then click view semesters. That's where you'll find the data collection windows. Yes, Kim, I will make sure that you get the appendices in Word format. Absolutely. So right now, Sherry, the new guide is set up as a PDF. It may take you a little while to download it, and I think it's just because the image on that front cover is so large. We've tried to compress that file a little bit, and it's helped, but it's still a pretty large file. So right now, it's just a PDF in the state Moodle, state assessment Moodle, but we'll make sure that we get the Word documents uploaded as well. We kind of want to make sure that we have any corrections made before we start posting all those documents that'll be used, because you guys know as well as I do, when the first one gets downloaded, you never know if it's going to be the correct one or the old one. Surfing, we're going to say that surfing is going to be our state assessment, and I'm saying that because there's really so much that goes into surfing, and we can talk more about that in our regional groups. Anything else? Jessica asked when the new assessment guides with the rubrics. It is available now. It is in the CTE State Assessment Moodle. So you should be able to access that. If you are not the PPOC and don't have access to that, reach out to your PPOC and they can share that document with you. And yes, Rhonda, thank you again to all of those who worked on the new guide. They were all so helpful and provided such great insight in this process. Okay, well, I know that we're way over. You only have a short break before the next session. So So please reach out to me if you have any questions. Be happy to answer those, and definitely be on the lookout for more training and support in your regional groups.
Misty, thank you so much. You did an awesome job. And I think we could all stay for the rest of the day and listen to all this. You've done such an awesome job on the guide as well as this presentation. And I hate to close this out, but we do have another one to run to. So we will see everybody at 9:45 in the reporting performance data session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.